So by 1973, 74, the work was no longer performance, no longer activity. It was what people were starting to call installations. Installation is, of all the vague terms that curators and critics have named art, installation might be the vaguest, since anything is installed. A painting is installed, a chair is installed in the room, etc. So I think those of us who were doing so-called installations probably desperately tried to give our own meanings to the word. And what interested me with the notion of installation was that was a notion of specificity of space. The way I was evolving pieces at this time was I didn't have a piece in mind until I was given a space to work with. Once I was given a gallery room or a museum room, now I could try to examine the particular quirks of that room. And the goal was, can I do something in this room, maybe for this room, that maybe I wouldn't have thought of in another room. The result was that I think the pieces that really worked probably could never be repeated. Why did that notion of specificity interest me so much? Because I really despise the idea of art being seen as some kind of universal thing. I didn't believe that. I believed, if something is called universal, I think all it means is that some power system of the time approves it, and therefore makes it seem as if this is universal. I wanted something to mean something, at this particular time, at this particular space. In some other place, in some other time, it probably shouldn't mean something. Meaning changes. Meaning isn't this constant thing. The other thing that was important to me about installations is that these installations were being done in places, a gallery, a museum, in places where there were people. So it seemed to me that people were an inherent part of these pieces. I had to make places for people. One example, a 1976 piece called "Where We Are Now," parentheses, who are we anyway? Was done in a New York gallery, Sonneban Gallery, in 420 West Broadway, that at that time sort of announced itself as this was the center of the New York art world, though probably in New York terms, it tried to announce itself as this is the center of the art world. The way you entered Sonneban Gallery at that time, the conventional entrance was the elevator that's around the corner of that black room. So you walk around an L-shaped corridor that leads you to what was usually used as the main room of the gallery. For the purpose of this piece, of this show, the doorway of the main room was blocked off. The room was painted black. Next to this black room is a long table, long wooden plank, stools on either side of the table. The table is propped up on the windowsill of the gallery, and then extends out of the window. So what begins as a table becomes a diving board. And probably the way I saw it, I think when you do a project, you're obviously trying to do something for others, but you're probably giving yourself a message too. And I think this piece was telling me I have to get out of a gallery. I have to find a way to leave. Yeah. All the pieces of the mid-70s use sound. In this case, there's a hanging speaker above the table. Why sound? Well, I think at that time one of the reasons I was using sound, and it was usually involving my voice. I wanted to get rid of myself, but I was probably afraid to. I didn't know. I was so used to doing pieces that used my own person that maybe I could get rid of my physical person, but I had to leave something behind. So it probably was a desperate attempt to try to keep myself there, even though I knew I shouldn't be there anymore. but there were certain things that interested me in sound much more than visual things. Conventional phrases like the song you can't get out of your head. The fact that in Western culture we talk about a mystic seeing things, but an insane person hears things. The Catholic Church, for example, can not make Joan of Arc a saint because she didn't have visions. She heard voices. So she's a crazy person. She's not a mystic. She's not a saint. In other words, sound in Western culture seems to have associated with it some kind of pressure, some kind of oppression. And I think that's why I was using sound in these pieces. I wanted sound to almost kind of push a listener up against the wall with the hope for a result that at some point a visitor starts to say, why am I being pushed like this? Why, how can I react to this? The most important influence for me on this time, but music has always been a major influence on work of mine. At this time, the things that were really important to me was the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, punk music of the mid-70s. For me, it was a whole different kind of music. It was very different than the single voice, long song of the late 60s. This was short songs, 1 minute songs, 1.5 minute songs. Maybe there's a single voice, but it sounded like a mass voice. Why were the songs so short? Because they were about a scream, and a scream couldn't last that long. A scream died out after a minute or so. Just some notion of this piece. There's a sound of the constant sound of a clock ticking, and as the clock is ticking, my voice comes in, saying things like, "Now that we're all here together, and what do you think, Bob? Now that we've gone as far as we can go, and what do you think, Barbara? Now that we know we failed, etc., etc., etc." Okay. I liked these pieces, but the liking of these pieces made me think that I was in the wrong place. And what I mean is, I liked these pieces because it seemed to me that they were trying to treat a gallery or a museum as if it's a plaza, as if it's a town square, as if it's a community meeting place, as if it's a public place. And I had to admit to myself at that time that I'm kidding myself. A museum or a gallery is never going to be a public place. If I really think my work needs a public place, I'd better find some way to get there. So I started to do pieces. That would lead me to public space. I had to realize and admit to myself that there were disciplines that already deal with public space. There's architecture, maybe industrial design, maybe landscape architecture. So I tried to maybe redo architecture for myself. My stuff had always been concerned with my own person. So I started to try to do pieces that the use of the piece by other people, by viewers, the use of the piece by viewers would start to make a structure, make an architecture. One example, and these pieces were all from maybe 1980 to 1982. This is a piece called Instant House in 1980. 4 panels, American flag covered on the floor. In the middle is a swing. If a visitor to the gallery sits in the swing starts to go down. These panels start to hinge up, rise up, making this instant house. And the instant house is an American flag house inside, Soviet flag house outside. So you make one kind of space for yourself, another kind of space as an announcement for others. What I liked about these pieces was that the house only lasted as long as a person kept the instrument going. You got up out of the swing, the walls now went down to nothing, became panels again. At the same time that I liked that, I started to think that maybe I'm not making use of houseness. You know, the thing about buildings or houseness is that you can go back, you can come again. So by the mid '80s, stuff was starting to have a more at least permanent existence. By this time I was thinking much more that I have to head towards architecture. If an architect makes a dream house, maybe I can make a bad dream house, which is what this is called in 1984. 3 upside down houses, 2 upside down houses, tilted, leaning against each other so that they support a 3rd upside down house on top. The houses on the ground, like houses you expect to find on the ground, brick facing, shingled roofs. They support on top more of a kind of garden house, glass house. You enter at either end at the open gable. You sit at or walk past an upside down table, or you go upstairs to what used to be the underside of the house. Now that it's upside down, the underside of the house becomes facing sets of seats, bleachers, or you go further upstairs to the glass house. Some panels are opaque, some transparent, some mirrored. It started to be clear to me at this time, if I'm making projects that make their own space, maybe I don't need galleries and museums. So I started to think, it was around this time, a little later, when I started to think that I have to start working differently. I can't work as a single person anymore, as a single agent. If I want to do architecture or something like architecture, it's clear that I don't know how. I haven't had architectural training. It's not as easy as art. You know, there's a kind of a professional degree involved. You know, so I thought, well, I have to start working with people who do know how to do architecture. So the Acconci studio started at the end of the 80s. What Acconci studio consists of, though it's having very serious financial problems lately, like every architectural firm, especially in the United States, but we assume we'll find some way to keep going. What Acconci studio isn't is I have an idea for a project and everybody else in the studio carries it out. It's much more of a kind of discussion group. I mean, one of the reasons to have the studio to me is that I want to mix what I have with things I don't have. So the people in the studio should be this mix of different kinds of abilities. You know, I mean, one person in the studio, and the studio tends to be consists now of people who are very, very computer adept, people who don't think of let's do a piece and then let's have the computer carry it out, but people who try to think with the computer. Some people who are very computer adept in the studio have said, you know, what the studio is a kind of mix of poetry and mathematics. You know, poetry that comes from me, maybe mathematics that comes from then, or maybe it's a mix of narrative, it's a mix of sentence structure and computer thinking. So okay, the one reason that I wanted to work with people was that I wanted to do architecture, and I realized I couldn't do it alone. But there was a just as important reason to work with other people. I started to think that if something comes from one person, I wonder if it could ever be anything but private. I started to think that maybe if you really want something to be public, to be really publicly used, it has to start from group thinking. It has to start from a number of people thinking together. And that probably means at least three people. One is a solo, two is a couple or a mirror image. The third person starts an argument, and public probably starts when an argument starts. So okay, so the studio has existed for 20 years. In the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, the kinds of projects we were asked to do were not so much real architecture projects, but so-called public art projects. The way public art projects exist in a lot of places, especially the United States, is that when a public building is built, 1% of that budget is allotted to art. At that time, I thought there was a reason for public art, because it only costs 1% of the architecture. You have a marginal amount of the money. Maybe you can represent a kind of marginal voice. After doing public art for a while, I started to think that 1% for art laws means that the art is worth 1% of the architecture. So I'm not sure if public art can ever be more than a kind of extra, more than a folly. But we made some attempts. These are some pieces from the late 90s. What we tended to do for projects like this was that since we were always doing something for a building that already existed or was already designed, we had to find some way to key into the building, tie into the building. So sometimes our projects would try to replicate elements of the site. This is the site of a project we did at Queens College in New York in the mid 90s. There's this kind of pass-through space in front of the English department building. On either side of the stairway going up to the building is a pedestal on top of which is a 1 meter diameter concrete sphere. Those concrete spheres became our starting point for the project. On the one hand, the concrete spheres seem to be trying to make a grandiose entrance out of what was only the entrance to an English department building. On the other hand, the concrete spheres seemed kind of isolated and alone. So what our project consisted of was, now that the concrete spheres are there, can we provide other spheres, more spheres? So the existing concrete spheres would be part of a field of spheres. Very small, ranging to the existing spheres, going to spheres 3 or 4 meters in diameter. The spheres are cut into, so you can walk between the spheres. As it becomes night, light comes out from the sphere.